Welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations about Culture and Christianity. Today, I am joined by Josh Harris. You might know him as Joshua Harris, the guy who wrote the book that you indulged or burned or whatever as a child, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Josh, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so our goal in this conversation for the listener is, Josh's book. I did youth ministry for a decade, grew up in the 90s. It was big. If you lived in, Christian culture, if you lived in the bubble, if you were homeschooled, if you were any part of that, then you probably read it. Or if you didn't read it directly, you probably heard some of the snippets or sound bites, or your youth pastor just stole some of the ideas out of it. And so I'm grateful to have that conversation. But, in more recent years, you've said, hey, we'll get into that, but I maybe made some mistakes, or I'm rethinking some of the things I wrote. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that, and just really how there's this word purity culture that we're really, I think, as a church and culture diving into, and was that good? How did that affect people? And we're hearing more and more maybe some of those negative effects of purity culture. And so great to have you join us. Humbled that you're willing to have this conversation, and looking forward to where it takes us.
I love the fact that we can have a conversation about ideas that, were popular 20 plus years ago. It's interesting that a lot of times we don't revisit the long-term implications. The Bible talks about the fruit. You can judge a tree by its fruit, and a lot of times we don't hang around long enough to actually see the fruit of decisions and ideas. So I appreciate you being willing to have the conversation. It's important.
Yeah. So we're going to go back a little bit in the time machine just to kind of get where your mindset was, get to know Josh, as you wrote this book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Just take us back to when you wrote it, why you wrote it, what was just happening in your life, kind of the church culture you grew up in, and maybe even wider Christian influences or things like that might have said, I need to write this book. People need this book. Yeah,
so I was a teenager in youth group in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was an era where there was a lot of conversation about the influence of culture, a lot of concern about secular media, MTV, all these different forces that were pulling kids away from the Lord, and a lot of concern and angst, I would say, among parents and leaders about kids, being sexually active. So the AIDS epidemic was a very real backdrop to all of this. There was a lot of fear around, what would happen if you were having sex, and, the consequence of unwanted pregnancy. So abortion was and still is a huge issue in the culture and for Christians. And so you add all those things up, and you had my parents' generation, who were like the hippies, in the 60s and 70s. They had their wild days, and now they were trying to protect their kids from that. We don't want our kids to experience the heartache that we experienced, the consequences that we experienced. So suddenly they have teenagers, and they're asking the common parenting question of, how do we control these kids? How do we protect these kids? What do we do? And for my parents, they went further than most people. They chose to homeschool, pulled me out of the regular school systems. Even Christian school was not quite safe enough. They wanted to be able to really train me and raise me up, and to follow the Lord. And then when I got to the age of being, in high school and was interested in girls and all of that, there was kind of that similar response of, we don't like this idea of our son and our kids going off and doing their own thing away from the family. What kind of trouble are they going to be getting into, and so on. So that was kind of swirling in the culture. So in the broader Christian community, the True Love Waits movement was happening. It was something that the Southern Baptist Convention was really pushing. I remember being in my my evangelical, mega church in Oregon as a teen, and we got these "I'm worth waiting for" stickers to put in our Bibles. So it was a really prominent message to save sex for marriage. So that was happening in the church. But then in the homeschool community, there was an even more intense conversation around dating itself is bad, and we should be doing courtship, or we should be doing betrothal. Like, there are all these different variations of that, where parents are like, we need to bring this back into the home. Kids shouldn't be driving around dating, that kind of a thing. So I was caught in the middle of all that, absorbing all of that. I had my high school girlfriend. We went too far in our physical relationship. I was feeling guilt around that. We broke up, and for the first time, I started listening to what my parents were saying. I read Elizabeth Elliot's book, Passion and Purity. I wanted to give this part of my life to the Lord. Like I felt like I'd hurt girls. I felt like I'd, damaged my own purity, all those different ideas. And so I Kissed Dating Goodbye was me as a 19, 20-year-old pulling my own very limited experience together with what I was seeing in the secular world, kind of like out of control sexuality, what I was hearing from my parents and their generation. And it was this attempt to say, hey, if we want to be serious about serving God, we've got to be serious in this area. He has to be Lord of this part of our life. And if we want to save sex, then we should be staying so far away from any activity that would be, leading to temptation. And so that's where the whole idea of we shouldn't even be dating came about.
As I think of just like now, it's not that hard for me to think in influencer culture, YouTube culture, all that a 19-year-old could publish a book and it could explode. But back in the 90s, like someone that's 19, 20, not on YouTube, all that kind of stuff, writing a book and Christians just coming, in the droves to buy it seems like so crazy, like far-fetched. Like, did you... Like, how did that happen? Like, what was just like the genesis of, okay, yeah, this 19, 20-year-old guy seems like he knows what he's doing and we should all listen to it. Like, did you imagine that was there? And how did the publishers?
Now I'm 50 years old, I've got kids that are 25 and 23 and 19. So I look back and I'm like, that's insane. I can't believe that this happened. But I think there are a couple of different factors. Number one, the homeschool community was a big part of the kind of grassroots group that spread this idea. Okay. So my dad was a very influential homeschool leader and teacher, did conferences across the country. I traveled with him and did those and spoke about, homeschooling in high school. I started a magazine. So before the internet, before people, could congregate on social media, that magazine was a community for a lot of homeschool teens.
Yeah.
I wrote the book, in that era where all these subscribers were aware of it and kind of anticipating it. So there was a platform there. And then I just think, even like you kind of look at it and you think it's ridiculous that, a 21-year-old anyone would listen to him when it comes to relationships. But I do think there's a tradition in the evangelical church to celebrate young adults who are taking their faith seriously. Like, there's nothing more encouraging in a church than somebody gets up on a Sunday and they're a young person and they're like, I'm following the Lord, or I'm going on a missions trip, or whatever it might be. Yeah. So there is built in, which I think is actually a beautiful thing, to celebrate like the next generation taking on values, advocating for things. It encourages parents, it encourages leaders. And so I think I was just an example of that, maybe on steroids a little bit, where it was like, hey, here's a young person who's saying the things that we are trying to get through to the next generation. And so then, that gets adopted and it gets passed on. And then a book takes on a life of its own, where it has a certain authority because it's popular. It has a certain authority because the pastor, some family gave it to him and he's like, oh, this sounds good. And he doesn't want his daughter to date and he's talking about it. And so then there's just like a snowball effect where it's not just my book that's shaping this environment. It's a ton of other things. I mean, I don't want to act like I was, invented all the, purity culture. I definitely poured gasoline on the fire, popularized a lot of these ideas, but the ideas were there. They were in other ministries. They were in other churches. There were other books before my own. And you just had the kind of perfect storm of all these leaders and parents pointing to a book, which was very, formulaic, very simplified, lacked nuance, took scripture out of context, taught things that are not in the Bible, used powerful stories that kind of instilled fear in people about things. So, the simplicity of it was part of why it spread so much. Nuance and careful, explanations were laid to the side because everybody was so fearful, and for me as a young person, my fear was, I want to control my own sexuality. I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to dishonor God. So I had my own fear, and then other people were using that content for their purposes because they were afraid of what their kids would do and all those kinds of things. And in those environments, there can be positive things that happen. There can be people who can be helped. But whenever I think fear and control are the things driving ideas, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage.
Yeah, so good. Like one of the things we often talk about on this podcast, and it drives people nuts that are like, I want there to be a resolution by the end of a conversation. And like,
Right.
There's often not. Like the things that we talk about, uncomfortable topics, like there's so much nuance, like how we both define a word. Like we've done,
So
whether
true.
that's Christian nationalism or the word woke or all of these things, like how we define those words makes a difference. And then people want us to end and say yes or no. And then they get frustrated that we didn't tell them how to think. And our hope is just put you in proximity to things and invite the Spirit to lead and guide that. But I love that.
Can I just stop for a second and just say, like, I respect the fact that you guys are doing it that way at your church so much. Like, I pastored for a long time, and I wish that we had that kind of an approach, but we were so, like, focused on, we got to control what people think. We got to protect them from other ideas. Like, we encouraged everybody to shop only in our church's bookstore. We controlled everything that went in there. Any, alternate theological perspective was shut out. And like, it takes so much like faith in God and trust in the Holy Spirit, like you mentioned, for you to be like, I don't have to try to like perfectly control everybody. But you're actually training people to think for themselves in a way that's so powerful. So I just want to say, like, kudos to you. Like,
thank you.
I respect that so much. I mean, the fact that you're even chatting with me, I'm a little shocked. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Anybody that says yes, we'll have a conversation with. They don't all get published, so we'll see. We'll see if this one makes a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
this will go on the
kidding.
shelf.
Yeah, I'm totally kidding. So when did you start to see that, okay, this book is getting bigger than maybe that insular community that you were part of? It's really affecting this whole purity culture. Like you said, you didn't start purity culture, but just threw gasoline on that fire. So when did you start to realize that, and like how were you responding as this stuff is just taken off?
Oh man, it sort of grew slowly. So it was selling slowly, and then suddenly more copies were selling, and we started to get attention from being on Dr. Dobson's Focus on the Family or Family Life Today, big radio shows back in the day, and that type of thing. And so it was something that was almost, shocking as it really picked up momentum. And for me, it was the first time I'd ever written a book. And so I was just kind of like, oh, this must be the way it works. Of course, it never happened again. But I would say it was overwhelming. I would say like the human brain, I don't know how much we can really process and handle that level of, multiplied human feedback. Nowadays, kids understand the concept of something going viral, that, somebody can make a TikTok and 50 million people can view it. But when you really stop to try to think about that many people with that many experiences, stories, contexts, all those things, it's completely overwhelming. Like, you can't really process that. And I couldn't really process hundreds of thousands of people reading this book. There's a crush of positive responses. There's a crush of negative responses. People are writing reviews on Amazon. This is the stupidest thing. Other people like, this is the most amazing thing. This is like God's message, and all those kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
And so, I think for me, I sort of shut down, like, even being able to process all of that completely, getting hundreds of letters in the mail, people's stories. Like, there are just so many human stories that are so powerful and heart-wrenching. People in abusive relationships, this book helped them get out of them. People who were, felt ostracized because they weren't dating. Suddenly they felt like, hey, I'm okay. Those kinds of stories. And that's where I think it's so hard for anyone, and, churches, pastors, leaders, authors, and so on, to comprehend and quantify the way ideas can spread and the way they can morph and they can, kind of evolve and mutate. And what I didn't see is that over time, these ideas did help some people, but then they created a culture for a lot of people that was extremely controlling. One person could read the book and find it freeing because it's like, you know what, I can, take control of my dating life and I don't have to feel pressured. But then another person who could literally be in the same church sitting next to them in the pew, because of their family circumstance, because of their personality, because of their experiences, they could read that same book and be filled with fear and take on all these twisted ideas about their sexuality and feel an incredible amount of shame. And then, 10, 15 years go by, and the consequence of those ideas in purity culture go with you into a marriage. And you get married and you saved yourself, for marriage, and you didn't have sex. And now suddenly you're married and sex isn't working as easily as you expected.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not pleasurable. Maybe you're filled with shame. You spent all these years saying sex is bad, and now you can't flip the switch and say sex is good. And you have marriages end. You have, problems. You have all these different challenges. Or people who passed up on relationships because of the ideas around purity culture, and years later look back and go, oh, I wish that I'd never read that book, all those kinds of things. And so the long-term consequence of ideas is something I think it's really hard for any community to really grapple with. And then it's really hard for anyone to take responsibility, because everybody wants to point a finger, and it is a web of influence. It's parents, and it's churches, and it's leaders, and it's authors, and it's multiple authors, and all those things. And it's easy for people to just kind of move on and say, well, I had a good experience. But then there can be a wake of, people in the wake of all that who are damaged and hurting and broken, and they're saying, hey, this did not work out for me. Yeah. And sadly, it took me a long time to listen to those stories.
Yeah. And I love that you're willing to explore that, and we'll talk maybe more about apologize, for that. I think back in my own life, I'm 38 now. And if I would have written books at 20, my first couple of years of Bible college, whether that be about human sexuality or dating or so many things that I look back as life has just taken me on different turns. I look back and I'm like, now I have a transgendered sibling. Like that, if I would have written books based on what the dogma I received from a church and a lot of those things, then that relationship would, if those thoughts that were in my head were published, I would have a quite the apology tour to do as I've grown in my own maturity and life's taken me places. And so I think it's just how those thoughts can continue to move on, is especially if they've exploded and people use them. I shared that I was going to have a conversation with you, and one lady reached out to me yesterday, and she said that her dad, before any of them could drive, made them read her and her siblings, I don't know if it was this book or a collection of purity culture things. He's like, unless you read these books, we're not buying you a car. And she said she doesn't have a relationship with her dad anymore because it was just so dogmatic and just the ripples from a lot of those things. And as parents, I think everyone was trying to do the best they could, right? They probably were responding in a large way to mistakes made and shame and the things that they felt. And they were like, I don't want my kids to feel this shame. I don't want them to feel this hurt. I don't want them to, I want to protect you. I want to put you in the bubble. And that's an ongoing thing. And so I'm curious, just as you watched it and you've, gone through the years of seeing how it was used, maybe weaponized, or you talked about it was used in good ways. I mean, it got people out of abusive relationships. How were those things processing in your mind as you're seeing, man, this is a lightning rod, and how can this be used for damage and for good? Like, it just seems like perplexing. Like, how are you processing those things?
Yeah, it was really hard to process. And it took a long time because I was defensive. I wanted to just focus on the positive reactions and the people who agreed and appreciated the content of the book. And, the book had been a big part of my identity. It's like, I'm the author of this book. I've done this. Like I've done this for the Lord, I've shared this message. And so just psychologically, it was hard to comprehend or process the idea of this thing that is me, this thing that it represents me doing a good job and being successful could actually be something negative for people. And so it honestly took a long time and a lot of just life humbling me to get to a place where I started to listen to some of those stories. So pastored for 17 years, fairly typical but traumatic church experiences with leadership fights and church splits and denominational drama. Our church, was hit with a lawsuit about wrongly reporting sexual abuse, like all these things that really, for me, were like, I've failed, like I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't do the right thing. I hurt people. And it was an era where, and I'll just say, thank God for the internet and for blogs, even though it was super painful at the time. But a lot of people never had a voice or any ability to speak to power structures, They couldn't speak to power structures in Hollywood. They couldn't speak to power structures in government. They couldn't speak to power structures in the church. And our church experienced that, where people who'd been sidelined, whose stories had been overridden, they suddenly were able to gather online and say, hey, we've had these experiences with leadership in this church movement. And so that started coming back to us as leaders in this church. And I'm so proud of the team of men that I serve with. We did try to listen to that, and we started the process of like actually asking questions and doing what, First Peter says of like, shepherds in the church are supposed to humbly care for the people and not harm them. And as we started listening to some of those stories, that was the first time for me where I was like, even well-intentioned leadership can lead to harm. You can create a culture where you say you're all about the gospel, but people feel just terrified of stepping out of line and getting, pushed out and all those kinds of things. And so I ended up stepping away from being a pastor. I was burnt out. I was weary. I moved across the continent to Canada to go to a graduate school of theology. So I became a student for the first time, and that was a place where I could lay aside like being a pastor and a leader who needed to have all the answers to being a student who was just listening and learning. And it was there with fellow students I started really hearing their stories and interacting with people online, where instead of just shutting them down like, oh, you applied it wrong, or you were legalistic, or, all these excuses, I was like, maybe there's something actually at the root of my book that's unhelpful. And that led to lots of different things. I mean, I really studied like the sociological and theological environment that I was in when I wrote it. I started having hundreds of conversations with people and hearing all these stories. And I got feedback, both positive and negative, but I started to recognize, wait a minute, this negative response, like there's a common pattern here. It's not just about how they applied it. There's actually, these are people who are trying their best to apply it. They're often hurt the most.
Yeah.
And that was incredibly unnerving. It was humbling, but it led to a process of me choosing to apologize for the book, which again was a long and bumpy process. It wasn't easy for me to do that. And eventually unpublish the book, actually take the book off the market. Because I got to a place where I realized, you know what, like the consistency of this book being problematic and unhelpful can't be overridden by the positive reactions. And if I disagree now with parts of it, I need to just state that and acknowledge where I think I got things wrong. And obviously that came too late for people. It doesn't fix things that have already happened, but it's my attempt to try to take responsibility for the part I played in, popularizing and spreading a lot of these ideas of purity culture.
Well, now I know that I've got a really valuable copy right here. Now that's been unpublished, old copy. So we'll give us the highest bidder at the end of everything. No, I'm kidding.
Oh gosh.
So like as you apologize, as you've had proximity to these stories and you've heard from these people and your position's changing, like how is that settling in your heart? What are those apologies doing for you? And then like, how is it affecting your faith? You're studying this theology, you're studying these things.
Yeah.
You leave pastoral ministry, discovering maybe some new theological truths and things like that for the first time. Where do you go from there?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot happening just personally in my own life, in my marriage in particular. I think the process of listening to all these stories of how the book and purity culture push people into marriages too quickly, without a lot of evaluation, without a lot of even experience with different types of people and partners and all those kinds of things. And so as I heard all these stories, I started realizing that they were mirroring my own experience. Like I lived the message of my book, I totally believed it. I totally bought into it. Didn't kiss my wife until we were married. She's now my ex-wife. But, I started to recognize all the ways that these ideas had shaped me. And so I think, the question that you ask is a really insightful one, how it affected my faith. I do think that anytime you start seeing that, there's one part of your kind of the construct of your life that was wrong, it opens you up to asking the question, what else have I gotten wrong?
Yeah.
Which is why I think, in a lot of church settings or religious settings, this is not just Christianity, any religious setting, or I would say even a political setting or whatever it might be, people don't like to admit they got anything wrong. They don't like to apologize because it does put you in this kind of weakened state where people start asking, well, what else have you gotten wrong? And I think that definitely took place for me. Our marriage came to an end, all these different parts of my life that had propped up my faith. And this is more, this isn't like everybody's experience. And I'm realizing ways that there is immaturity to my faith and my own experience, but there were a lot of identity markers that were so intermingled with my sense of being a Christian that when those identity markers started to fall apart, it felt like my faith had fallen apart. And I now am able to look back and go, well, no, that's not really how it has to be. But I kind of had that kind of mindset of like, I'm a Christian and that's so tied to I'm a pastor and this is my calling and I'm going to pastor for years. And so then when I faced failure and I realized, oh, I don't want to be a pastor anymore, that's like, it started to shake my own sense of self. And then when I, apologized for this book and unpublished a book, which was a huge part of like, I'm someone who serves God and carries his message. It's like, it shook my sense of like, am I really? Like, what's really going on here? And when my marriage came to an end, it really did feel like this is this sin that like I must not be a Christian if I'm willing to follow through on a divorce. Like that was the kind of mindset that we carried in our church. We practiced, we, pushed people out who sinned in different ways. And I kind of did that to myself in many ways. So it wasn't so much this like theological, intellectual struggle for me of like, well, I don't believe these different things, so now I'm no longer a Christian. For me, it was like this crumbling of my life and my identity that was so, wrapped around my sense of faith that it was like when everything fell apart, I was like, well, I must not believe, or I definitely don't believe in the same way. And so it was definitely a time of real just crumbling, everything around me crumbling. And it led to a season, which I still think I'm in, where I'm kind of like stepped away from all the things that I thought I knew, and I'm just trying to be a seeker. I'm trying to be open to asking questions. I'm trying to get over an addiction to certainty, where it's like I have to know everything perfectly, and that's why I'm right with God, because I've got all the right theological answers and so on. And now I'm trying to say, well, is it possible to like believe and have faith and not be like perfectly certain about all these, this long list of items? Yeah. So it's been a real journey for me, for sure.
It is the irony of people, especially all people, wanting certainty, but people of the Christian faith, and we're like, but certainty and faith seem like they are opposites oftentimes.
Yeah, it's so like kind of self-evident when you say it, but for some reason I completely missed that one.
Yeah. So yeah, I was going to ask that. I was looking at your website, joshharris.com, and last year, almost a year ago, September 11th last year, you kind of gave your Christian phases so far, from evangelical to, I think the last update you have here is happy, unsure seeker who still prays to Jesus and visit church, but is less triggered towards religion because no one has it figured out as a human being. Is that where you're still at? There's a question mark after that. Are you? Is there been more?
No, I mean, progress? I think that's fairly accurate. I go to church in intervals. I do still pray in Jesus' name. I still am very aware of my longing for the transcendent, my longing for connection to something beyond myself. I think I'm definitely still in that place where a lot of the trappings of the way I connected to God and to spirituality, they can be a big distraction at times, but they're like the only ways that I learned to connect with God, So for me, going to a church service and worshiping or listening to a sermon, all those things, having a quiet time, like those were the pathways for years that I felt a connection to God. And now those pathways are distracting because they remind me of hard times in my life. They remind me of people who let me down, all those types of things. And so I definitely am in a place where I'm trying to understand different pathways that people of faith have had over the years. Like I'm realizing, this isn't the only way to do it. That's just the only way that you knew to do it. So I'm exploring that. And then I'm exploring, I would say maybe the thing I would add to that list is I'm trying to listen to and learn from Christians who take a very different approach than the one that I was, involved in my years as a pastor and as a believer, which again, very black and white, very much based on certainty, very much based on we are the purest of the we're the purest church you could get. We're the perfect mix. We're charismatic and reformed, and here's what we believe about marriage and about scripture and all those different boxes to check off. And I'm trying to say, okay, are there other streams of Christianity where they've approached things differently? Are there different ways to read these same scriptures? can I learn from that? What happens when I do that? And that's ongoing and unfolding for me.
Yeah, so good. And I've been through several of those processes myself. Like I grew up very charismatic, evangelical. Like we would, if you told someone that you were going to plan a series that's 6 weeks and the Holy Spirit wasn't just like imparting into the pastor the day before what he should speak on, like we had told you, you're crazy. You're not leaving room for the Holy Spirit. Like all of these things, like there was no liturgy, no pattern. And I married my wife who grew up Roman Catholic, and
wow,
it taught me so much about liturgies. Like liturgy was, I mean, there were of course liturgies in my life, but in the same way, heart-shaping practices, reading people like James K. Smith and things like that have been such a breath of fresh air for somebody that's very much like, that's all dogmatic, that's all
interesting,
just religion, it's all stoic, it's all those things. And you're like, wait, but there's life to this. There's life to my senses, like my smell being engaged and all these kinds of things. And so it's a cool,
beautiful,
fun, humbling journey, because you have to walk back on some places. Maybe you put a anchor in the ground, and you have to admit that. I'm curious about, because there is a phase in here, the deconstructed angry ex-Christian phrase. I don't want to necessarily maybe know all about that, but I know a lot of people that have been there, and some of the meanest people to those, some of the harshest critics, the people that can't understand are those in the church, right? So what were some of the, I don't know, just ways that people responded to you that were hurtful or said about you when you're in that phase of like, man, I'm rejecting this, I'm deconstructing, maybe I'm even angry as a Christian or at Christians? I'm just curious there.
Well, the thing I would say is I want to just avoid any kind of prescriptive explanation for how these like experiences unfold for people. Another person's experience could be totally different than mine. I'm not like wanting to say I've evolved past some person or anything like that, but I'll just say for myself, when I stepped away from like for me, again, it was a crazy time in my life where I just felt like I needed to say, hey guys, like I don't believe the same way anymore. I'm getting divorced. I'm trying to, be affirming and support my gay friends. Like I don't want to have a big theological debate with everybody. Like I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. So for me, it was kind of like I'm stepping outside of this, which, came across as incredibly shocking to people. It was definitely, more dramatic maybe than it needed to be. But for me personally, it was this way of being like, I want to be authentic. Like, I don't want everyone to think I'm this person that believes all these things when in reality, I'm, living completely differently. I want to be real with you. Like, I'm not there anymore. I think a lot of people who maybe would go through like similar circumstances wouldn't have to do that. They can just like, maybe they just skip church a couple weeks. Maybe they're, nobody notices, you know what I mean? Like, or people can literally be in church for years and they can be deconstructing all kinds of stuff. Nobody cares. Nobody notices, But for me, because of the public profile I had, I was just like, I'm out, guys. Like, leave me alone kind of a thing. And that led to a season where I was processing ways that I had believed for a long time. Why did I do that? Or why did other people treat me this way? Or, oh my gosh, I feel like I was used by this system, or, oh my gosh, like I gave so much money to the church over the years, like all these kinds of feelings. And, I'm hitting this wall in midlife where things did not turn out as I expected, all these things that I thought, if you just do these things, everything will be fine. And so I'm mad at myself. I'm mad at the church. I'm mad at just the universe. Like I just am, in this place. And I think when you get to that kind of place, it's then so easy to find community and solidarity and friendship with other people who are in that place. They're hurting. And it's easy to jump ship from one kind of black and white thinking to another black and white thinking. Like the hard thing, and I'm still in this process, the hard thing is to let go of black and white thinking and say, I want to be open. I want to be learning. I want to be listening to all different sides and perspectives. That feels very unsafe. It feels much safer to be like, I'm a dogmatic Christian. Now I'm a dogmatic, deconstructed, progressive, whatever you want to call it, where you just have a new set of rules. You can say, if I believe all these things, then I'm safe and I have community. So, for me, a lot of that anger, I found a new sense of community with other deconstructed people. I found this, a sense of purpose. And yet for me, that wasn't always healthy because it was still the same, dogmatic certainty addiction kind of approach to life. And so I did kind of burn out pretty quickly in that. And then you start to recognize, oh, all humans are the same, Like you can be in super progressive circles, super woke circles, and they can be just as legalistic as Christians, but they just have different rules. Yeah. And you start recognizing, oh, we're all prone to these things. We're all looking for certainty. We're all looking for connection and identity and so on. So that's led to a time in my life where I'm just trying to be more empathetic towards everybody and so see the human story in everybody.
That's so good. So, I mean, what keeps you or has kept you coming back to Jesus? Like, what do you think about Jesus? You said you pray in his name still, all that. So like, what do you find compelling about Jesus?
Well, I think for me, this upside down approach to the world and power structures that says, winning is not about having control over and forcing something on people. Literally the concept of the cross, which, so many people have so many different theological perspectives of, but at the heart of it, that story, just from a very like surface level, is someone letting go of the typical approach to power, control, victory, if you will, and a care for the weak and the outcasts and the people who don't fit and have not like won in the system. To me, that's incredibly compelling. And for so long, I had been at the top of the pyramid, when it comes to the church. Like, I was climbing the ladder of Christian success for so long. And I just was, of course, I thought it was wonderful because it only benefited me, you know? It's like, oh, wonderful. Like, you share God's message and you sell a bunch of books and you're a leader and everyone praises you and thanks you and respects you and you get all these different things. And so I kind of won in that system for so long. And then through failure and mistakes and things falling apart, suddenly you're on the outside. And it's really interesting. I mean, you kind of see the stories and the life of Jesus from a different lens. And you have this weird moment where you're like, oh my gosh, like I've actually been in, if I were anyone in this story over the years, I'm the religious leader. You know what I mean? Like I'm the Pharisees. And then suddenly you're having an experience where you're like the immoral woman who's about to get stoned. And you just like, you read the stories from a different vantage point when you've had that kind of failure and loss and sense of being an outcast. So that's really powerful for me. And I think the other thing that's really powerful, and I'm just trying to still understand, is I just think that the Christian story, the stories of the scripture, the tradition of all these generations of people who have like reached towards transcendence and the divine in a certain way, the Christian tradition, all the different variations of it, that to me, I'm now coming back to as a more meaningful thing in a similar way that I think you almost, I use the analogy of like an immigrant. An immigrant comes to a new country, they're embarrassed of their past life, they're kind of, they kind of poo-poo it like, oh, I want to learn a new language. I want to leave all this behind. And then you come to this stage where you're like, wait a minute, like actually that story and that heritage is just ingrained in me. Like it's my first language. It's beautiful. And I feel that way about the Christian faith. I don't have all the answers about what I think is exactly true or exactly how to hold it, but I'm coming to this sense of like peace with the idea of this story is like in my DNA, this heritage, this tradition, like I'm never going to get away from it. And how do I make peace with that? How do I find, meaning and truth and connection to the divine in that? So that's part of it for me as well.
That's so good. And I love that part you talked about as you read, the scriptures and the narratives of, man, we often place ourselves in the position of the hero, right? Like we're not the, I mean, the example is the Good Samaritan, we're all trying to be the Good Samaritan. And like my take is like, I think Jesus was trying to help us see we are the person that's dead on the side of the road. And unless a Good Samaritan came along, which is him, then we would be all up a creek with that. But we are all like, I'm trying to be a Good Samaritan. I'm like, first you need to realize how dead, how broken, how lost you were, and then have a little bit of humility. And I think that's the truth. Only humility can get you out of the mess pride's gotten you into. And I hear so much of that in your story and the willingness to walk in humility and all those things. And so that's so good. So just in kind of closing, what's next? Like what are you doing? You kind of got on the map for publishing this book. It's unpublished. You kissed dating goodbye. You got married. Now you're divorced. Like what? Like as you're discovering your identity, what's next? What are you doing vocationally, and what do you feel a sense of call and purpose towards in the next half of your life?
Yeah, I'm just living a really simple, beautiful life. I got remarried a year ago to a wonderful Anglican girl named Kelly. She's amazing, and so we're building a life together up in British Columbia in wine country, as they call it, the Okanagan. So that relationship has been incredibly healing and important for me. Vocationally, I've been using my just passion for words and communication to do work coaching people who are trying to communicate their own story. A lot of times that's individuals or businesses and so on. So I create websites for people and help them at the strategy level to tap into their kind of core message and how to communicate that out. And then just in terms of like on the level of what's really meaningful to me, making sense of my, first half of life, processing that, and then trying to put something into the world that is hopeful and helpful and healing, And for me, that's having conversations like this, where my story can encourage other people who have had a similar experience, or, even just like talking about this past book and saying, hey, I'm so sorry for the ways that this might have harmed people. There are people out there who are still carrying around some heavy burdens because of those ideas. And if me, publicly saying, hey, like I've learned that this isn't helpful. There's a lot of this that's not really from the Bible. And I hope you can, move forward and heal. If that can help even one person, that's super meaningful to me. And also just trying to platform, people who are doing this kind of work. So, or partner with, I think is probably a better way to put it. So there's an amazing, Dr. Hillary McBride. She's a psychologist and author. She's written all these incredible books about embodiment and your relationship with the body. And she just wrote a book called Holy Hurt, which is about spiritual trauma and healing from spiritual hurt that you've experienced, whether it's from your family or from a book like mine, purity culture, or a church, or whatever it might be. And so we did this like public gathering where we just had a conversation around this, and it was so powerful. Like, it was so meaningful for me to hear her with her background in research and, discussion around spiritual trauma, and my story being kind of a part of gathering people and talking about how you can move forward. So we're just like going around and doing these events in the coming year, not trying to make money from it, just trying to donate the profits to worthy causes, those kinds of things. And like, that is so meaningful to me. And I not to over spiritualize this, but I feel like it represents like Jesus' heart, to like go towards people who have been damaged by religious structures or religious systems, and try to, hold out hope that they can heal, they can grow beyond that, whether they're Christians or they've deconstructed or they're atheists or whatever it might be. Like, the church has had a massive impact, and there is a lot of, collateral damage and pain and hurt out there. And so just to be able to participate and support Hillary in that is like really meaningful to me.
That's cool. Yeah, I took that note, so I'm going to follow up and look more into that stuff. So I guess the question I have is, like, if we do have a listener that's, you ruin their life, that's probably a little extra, but they're giving you too much power if you ruin their life. But and that book, and it just caused trauma and pain. Like, I guess, what would that apology look like? Like, if you're just picturing that person in front of you, I'm sure you've done this, but what would you say? What does that look like as you've done those kinds of things? If you were like to speak first person to somebody,
sure. Well, I think the first thing I'd want to say to them is, like, I know how real this is, and I know how a book or, these ideas that somebody gave to you can have like such a shaping influence in your life and can cause so much regret. And I just want to like acknowledge, like, that's a real thing. I know that my book did those kinds of things to people. And if that happened to you, I'm so regretful, so sorry that it put fear in your heart, distorted your view of yourself, your body, God, all these different things. And I wish I could, take that back. I wish I could somehow erase that. But I hope that you can move forward and shed a lot of those ideas. And I have seen in my own life and in the lives of so many other people that, like, there's life and there's hope beyond a lot of those constraining, restricting ideas. But at the end of the day, I just a sincere apology. I'm so sorry that it impacted you in that way.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. And I think for people listening, I think that'll be a powerful, freeing thing. So thanks for, again, just modeling the humility that we often talk about, but rarely do leaders do. It's kind of a platitude sometimes. So I appreciate you doing that. And for everybody else, thank you again for listening to the podcast. If you've got more to share with us, you've got comments, questions, you can reach out to us, podcast@cccomaha.org. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, @CCCOMA podcast. We love to hear from you, actually, by leaving us a voicemail so we can talk about it on the show, 402-885-9930. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.